Hey guys, what's up? My name is Zach, and today we're going to be doing a 2018 Senate election prediction. So, today's September 1st, and as always, to start the month, I'm going to be doing a Senate election prediction along with a few 2020 election predictions between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, people who I think are most likely to be the candidates for 2020. So let's get right into it. We're going to call the safe states first. Overall, I think there's about less than 70 days until the midterms, and currently I think it's becoming safer and safer to call certain states and certain columns, especially considering that there's not a whole lot of time for either side to make any lasting impact that would heavily affect the midterms in November. So it's becoming safer and safer to call this election and more likely to call it a certain way. So in Nebraska, I know this state's been listed as likely red rather than solid red. But overall, I don't think there's a chance for Jane Raybould to win this state, considering its Republican identity and considering the fact that she has not been doing even remotely good in polls between her and Deb Fischer. So I'd call it solid. And the special election here, I'm not going to call solid this time, considering the fact that it's an open primary and that there's a number of factors that I'm going to have to get to in order to explain why it wouldn't be solid. And let's just do that first. So Mississippi, there's a three-way race between Cindy Hyde-Smith, the incumbent, Mike Epsy, the SV, the former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, and a third candidate who is also a Republican. So the reason why the state is not solid red is because that Republican is probably going to split a significant amount of the vote away from Cindy Hyde-Smith and making the room for Mike Espy to win, and the fact that he does have Mike Espy does have a very high name recognition, being the former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, and you also have to consider Trump's high approval in the state overall, and for that reason I'm going to call it likely in Cindy Hyde-Smith column, just because I think the only way for Mike Espy to actually win in this state is to really drive the wedge between Cindy Hyde-Smith and the third Republican challenger, and to really boost his name recognition. And it would be a miracle if Mike Espy were to win in this state, to say the least. Going over to Minnesota's special election between Tina Smith and Karen Housley. Overall, I think that I'd call it likely in Tina Smith's column, and this is mostly because Tina Smith is leading very consistently in polls between her and Karen Housley. She's outraising Karen Housley 4-1 in fundraising, and Trump does have a very low approval in Minnesota overall, and Karen Housley doesn't have the decent name recognition being a state senator, so I'd call it likely in Tina Smith's column for that reason. Michigan, I would call likely in Debbie Stabenow's column. This is a very interesting race overall. John James has been getting a lot of media coverage, especially from Fox News. Mostly because of his youth and the fact that he's an African-American senator an African-American businessman running for the Senate. He's young and he's very charismatic. He's a very good candidate for the Republicans to run in the state overall. However, the polls do not reflect that. They definitively are in Debbie Stabenow's favor. It's not even remotely close. She's leading by mostly plus 10 or above points. And there's also going to be a number of third-party candidates in this race, including many Constitution Party candidates, Libertarian Party candidates who are going to be on the ticket and who won't just be write-ins, they'll be on the ballot. So I think that's going to take a significant amount, or not a significant amount, but in a race that is probably going to be a bit close, it's a factor regardless. So for those reasons, I would call it in Debbie Stabenow's column as likely. And Trump's low approval is obviously a factor in this state, considering it's at minus 10 plus. I'm not too sure what the exact number is, but it's low in Michigan. As for Pennsylvania, I'd call it likely in Bob Casey's column. Casey is ahead in every single poll between Lou Barletta by a very, very large margin. And Trump's low approval is obviously a factor in this state. It's at above minus 10, which makes it a big factor for whoever the Democrat is. Bob Casey's an incumbent. He has a definitive incumbent advantage on his side. And Casey is outraising Barletta by a lot. Like, if you look at the numbers, it is a very big margin between how much Bob Casey's outraising Lou Barletta. Overall, I think Democrats are doing a very good job at outraising their competitors throughout the United States, pretty much across the board with some exceptions, which I'll get to. So overall, likely in Bob Casey's column. Wisconsin, I would call likely in Tammy Baldwin's column. She's leading ahead in every single poll between her and Leah Vukmir. It's either Vukmir or Vukmir. I haven't clarified. Vukmir sounds better, so that's what I'm going to use. Trump has a very low approval in Wisconsin, lower than Minnesota or Michigan, which is surprising, and I've covered how that's pretty surprising in my past few election prediction videos. Vukmir had a very close primary between her and the Republican competitor whose name I can't remember right now, but it was very close. It came down to a very slim margin, and she was edged out. And one thing that's very much worth mentioning is Baldwin is outraising Vukmir 11-1. 11-1. That is quite the margin, and she is definitely beating Vukmir in terms of fundraising. And obviously Baldwin does have a definitive incumbent advantage in this race, and she does have a pretty decent approval in Wisconsin as well, making this state go likely in her column. Going over to Montana, I call that likely in Jon Tester's column. Matt Rosendale was not a good choice for. Well, I mean, they didn't really have a lot of options to begin with when it came to nominations for Montana, and Matt Rosendale probably will not do very well against Jon Tester, mostly because of his low name recognition, which is not very good. Jon Tester is a very popular incumbent, especially considering the fact that he's a Democrat from what many would consider to be a solid red state. He's ahead in the polls between him and Matt Rosendale, leading fairly consistently, I'd say, by +5 or above %. Tester is outraising Rosendale by a lot as well, a very large margin. I'm not too sure what the exact margins are, but he is outraising Rosendale by a lot. And Trump does have a slightly high approval in the state, but it is low regardless for a solid red state. He's leading by +4% net approval in Montana, and that I'd say is very low for a solid for what many would consider to be a solid red state. So for that reason, I would call it likely in Jon Tester's column, and obviously incumbent advantage is a factor as well. So likely in Jon Tester's column. Going over to Ohio, I would call that, I don't know what I just did. Oh, crap. All right. Sorry about that. Ohio I would call likely in Sherrod Brown's column. Brown's leading consistently in polls against Jim Renacci, U.S. representative in the state. And Trump's does have a very narrowly low approval in the state. It's -1, and it's been pretty much down the middle for the past few months, but that is a factor regardless, mostly in Sherrod Brown's column. Brown's outraising Renacci almost 4-1, so pretty decent margins that he's outraising him by, and incumbent advantages also benefit from as well. Sherrod Brown is a fairly popular senator coming from a state that is a toss-up state like Ohio. So for those reasons, I would list this election likely for the Democrats in Sherrod Brown's column. Going over to West Virginia, I would list this likely for the Democrats as well. Manchin is leading very consistently in polls against Patrick Morrisey, and Manchin is also outraising Morrisey 3-1. Incumbent advantage is always a factor. And overall, despite the fact that this state is solid red, Joe Manchin is overcoming those odds and is doing tremendously well against Patrick Morrisey. And for those reasons, I would list this likely in Joe Manchin's column. Now going over to the leaning states, I would list Texas as leaning, and this is a very big change from my past few election predictions, and this mainly comes down to the fact that Beto is doing better now than he ever has before. Polls are narrowing. The most recent poll came out, Ted Cruz is only leading by +1%, which is shocking considering that he was leading pretty consistently by +5, +6, +7 in the past polls, but this one came out, he was leading by only +1. Trump does have a higher approval in this state overall. +8 is, I believe, what it's at now at net approval, and that is much higher than it's been in the past few months, especially. It used to be very close in Texas, but that's no longer the case. So Trump's approval is definitely a big factor for Ted Cruz. Beto does have a lack of Hispanic approval, and I cover this pretty heavily in my Texas Senate analysis video, which you guys can check out if you want to. Beto O'Rourke, and I think this is really reflected in his primary victory as well, he lost most of the southern part of Texas, which is the predominantly Hispanic part, and that part of Texas went to a Hispanic candidate who was running as well for the Democratic nomination, and Beto O'Rourke lost that part of Texas, but he still won the nomination overall. But I think that lack of Hispanic appeal is going to be a big minus in his column. Cruz does have a decent approval in Texas as well. That's something that is in his column, and Cruz is very narrowly outraising Beto O'Rourke. It's very close for the most part. Beto O'Rourke does have more cash on hand, I believe, but overall Ted Cruz is narrowly outraising and outspending Beto O'Rourke. And for those reasons, I'd list this as a lean, which is down from a likely, which is what I used to list it as in my past few election predictions and in my Texas Senate analysis, mostly because of how close the polls are becoming and the fact that Beto O'Rourke seems to be doing better in Texas overall. This could very easily go back to a likely. I can see that happening pretty easily in the next 10 or 20 days, but for now, I'd list that as a lean. Going over to Nevada, I'd list that as a lean in Jackie Rosen's column. Rosen is leading very slightly in polls. Overall, they're very close between Dean Heller and Jackie Rosen, but Jackie Rosen is leading very narrowly. Obama did endorse Jackie Rosen. She's one of the very few candidates that Obama did endorse, and that's going to be a factor in a state like Nevada, which Obama won by very solid margins during both his election campaigns in 2008 and 2012. There's many third-party candidates running in this state, just like Michigan. Many Libertarian, I believe Constitution, maybe a Green Party candidate, but there's a lot of third-party candidates who I do believe qualify for the ballot in Nevada, which will really split the vote, mostly for Dean Heller, because it was mainly just Constitution Party, which is right-wing, so that's going to be an obstacle for Dean Heller. Trump does have a very low approval in Nevada. It used to be closer in the past few months, but now it is at minus 10 plus, I believe, which for Nevada is a state that was pretty close in 2016, is not good for Trump. So Trump's low approval, obviously a factor. Heller is narrowly outraising Rosen, very narrowly. I think Rosen might lead in on-hand cash, but Dean Heller still outraising Rosen. And Heller does have a low approval in Nevada overall, and that's going to be an obstacle for him, obviously. But overall, this is the first state I would flip from red to blue in Jackie Rosen's column. And yeah, a lean in Jackie Rosen's column. Going into Arizona, this is honestly my favorite Senate race just because of how interesting it is overall. I'd call it a lean in Sinema's column, which I talked about in my last video during the primaries. So if you guys would watch my last video where I talked about the Arizona primaries, Martha McSally did very good in the primaries, which I think is a benefit for her. The incumbent, Jeff Flake, does have a very low approval. He's one of the lowest approved of senators across the United States, and it's going to be a factor. Even though he's not running, it's still going to be a factor. Trump has a very narrow approval, 50-50 split, and for the most part, it's down in Arizona, which is a factor in Kyrsten Sinema's column. Sinema is leading very consistently in polls. I believe she's led against Martha McSally by +5 or above or around that range against Martha McSally in just about every single poll, and that's a big benefit in her column. And Sinema is outraising McSally as well. That's a big factor for Sinema, especially for a Democrat in Arizona. Overall, I'd list this as a lean in Kyrsten Sinema's column. The second state I'll be flipping from red to blue. Going over to Missouri, this is going to be... Oh, I forgot to fill in New Mexico. Jeez. Yeah, that'd be solid as well. Obviously, not a whole lot to talk about there. Actually, Gary Johnson, who most of you know is running for the Senate in New Mexico. Many people are saying that this changes the race in New Mexico completely. I completely disagree. I think that Gary Johnson will get a significant number of the vote, but that's not going to change the fact that Martin Heinrich is still strongly favored to win in this state. If anything, it makes him even more favored to win because Gary Johnson is probably going to peel away from Mick Rich, if anything, the Republican margins, and not from the Democrats. I can't see a Libertarian peeling the vote away from Democrats in general. So for those reasons, I would list this as solidly in the Democrats' column, despite Gary Johnson running. And then going to Missouri, I would list this as leaning in Claire McCaskill's column, and this is one of the more difficult states to call as we get down to the last few states. Josh Hawley is leading very narrowly in polls, but it's kind of hard to say because most of the polls have just ended up being ties, and then Josh Hawley is leading by like 0.5% because one of the polls had him leading by a very small margin. But overall, polls are split, I'd say 50-50 between Claire McCaskill and Josh Hawley. Overall, I think that Hawley's ties to former Governor Greitens, again, I think that's how you pronounce his name, I should probably check that, but Greitens, I think, is how you pronounce his name. He was the governor of Missouri, who was involved in a huge amount of scandals, and I think that's going to be a big... I think that Josh Hawley being the Missouri Attorney General can be tied to Greitens overall, and that's a negative for him. McCaskill also outraises Hawley 4-1, which is a big benefit for McCaskill. and overall listed as a lean in McCaskill's column. It's going to be close. It's going to be a very close state. And Trump's high approval in the state is also a factor as well. It's not tremendously high, but it's at +8, I believe, which is decent. And overall, I think that Claire McCaskill will be able to pick up the win in this state. Going over to North Dakota, we're getting down to tilts now. The closest states. I would list this as a tilt in Kevin Cramer's column. Heitkamp had a very, very narrow victory last election, which he barely won at all. And Cramer's leading in polls by a very, very slim margin. Trump does have a slightly high approval in the state. It's at +4, which is the same as Montana. But it is high regardless. Not high overall, it should be higher. I think that +4 is pretty low for Republican in North Dakota. And Heitkamp is also outraising Cramer 3-1. So overall, the state is very hard to call, and the lack of polling, I think, in general is kind of difficult, makes it difficult to call. But Kevin Cramer, I think, is a very good candidate for the Republicans, and I think that he will flip the state from blue to red in the Senate. So I'd call it as a tilt in Kevin Cramer's column. Going over to Indiana, I would call that as a tilt in Joe Donnelly's column, and this comes down to the fact that Trump has a narrowly high approval in this state. It should be higher considering that he does have Mike Pence in his administration, but it isn't. In fact, I think that if Mike Pence wasn't Trump's vice president, this state would be even closer, maybe even competitive, but that's not the case. I think that Mike Pence changes a lot of things when it comes to Trump's approval in the state. But Donnelly is outraising Braun narrowly, by not a whole lot, I think by like a few million, but he is outraising him. There's been a lack of reliable polls in Indiana. However, there was a poll that showed Donnelly by +12, but I'm going to take that with a grain of salt because that's like the only one of 2 polls that have been released. The other one showed Mike Braun ahead by +1, and that one had +12, so that might be an outlier. I don't know. But overall, this is a very, very close state, and I'm going to call it a narrow tilt in Joe Donnelly's column. And this comes down to the fact that Donnelly is outraising Braun. Trump's approval should be higher, but isn't. And Mike Braun probably doesn't have as much name recognition as Joe Donnelly does. And for those reasons, I would call it narrowly, very narrowly in Joe Donnelly's column. And if you guys would like to see me do an analysis of this state, or any of these states actually, please feel free to leave down below. I do very much enjoy doing analyses of Senate races, and if you guys would like to see one in particular, please let me know down below. I might do one of Indiana, regardless, just because it's one of the more interesting Senate races. Going over to Tennessee, I would call this a tilt in the Democrats' column, giving the Democrats one away from taking the majority. This comes down to the fact that Bredesen is leading in polls narrowly. I think it's now by like 3 or 4% against Marsha Blackburn, but he's still leading, which is astonishing for a state like Tennessee. Trump does have a high approval in the state, obviously, being a part of the South. Trump's approval is pretty high. I believe above 10%. Don't quote me on that, but I do believe it's above 10%. His net approval in Tennessee. Bredesen had tremendous popularity as a governor of Tennessee during both terms, winning every single county in Tennessee during his re-election campaign. He left with a 60% approval rating, which is astonishing for a Democrat as a statewide official in Tennessee. Corker's resignation is a factor. There's no incumbent advantage, and Marsha Blackburn will have to run just on her own record without incumbent advantage. And Bredesen is outraising Blackburn as well. With all those factors taken into consideration, I would list this as a tilt in the Democrats' column. Overall, this state is being listed for the most part as a tilt towards the Republicans, and if not a toss-up. I think that I understand that just because it's a typically red state. But when you look at the factors and just the factors, rather than irrationally call it just for the Republicans just because it's a typically Republican state, you can reach the conclusion that this state can be that the state is tilting in Phil Bredesen's column once you examine factors like Corker's resignation, Bredesen outraising Blackburn, Bredesen's popularity as governor. It's understandable that the state can be a tilt in the Democrats' column. Now going down to Florida, this is the hardest state to call and the most interesting race, I think, in general. I'm going to call it a tilt in the Republicans' column. And this comes down to the fact that there's very close polling. Bill Nelson and Rick Scott are neck and neck in polling. Trump has a fairly decent approval, which I think is probably the largest factor in the state. Trump's approval is at +4, I believe, which for a flip state like Florida shocking, I think, and I think it's going to be a big benefit for Rick Scott and for any Republican running in a statewide race in Florida in general. It's going to be Trump's approval. Scott and Nelson both have a decent approval as senator and as governor, respectively. Rick Scott has a very high approval as governor. Bill Nelson has a very high approval as a senator. And Scott, this is also a very big factor, Scott is outraising Nelson by a pretty large amount. Rick Scott is very, very wealthy, at least compared to Bill Nelson. Bill Nelson's pretty wealthy as well, but Rick Scott, I think, is probably the wealthiest governor in the United States, and he's poured in a lot of his own personal wealth into this race. And if you look at the fundraising numbers, he is really outraising Bill Nelson. So with this fact taken into consideration, I'd call this state a tilt in the Republicans' column. So this is where the race stands today. Overall, I think that's an uphill climb. It's always been an uphill climb for the Democrats, just given the races that are up to begin with. But overall, I think a 50-50 split is very likely in the Senate, giving the Republicans a technical majority with the vice president factor. But overall, I think the only chance the Democrats have at winning is Florida, and the only way for them to win Florida is to really just pour in everything they have. But then they risk losing states like Tennessee and Indiana, which I think is very likely for these states to fall out of their column. Texas is a bit of a wild card right now, but I think in the end it will probably fall in the Republicans' column. Overall, this is a very tough race for the Democrats, and I think the Republicans will end up keeping their majority overall. But still, they succeed in narrowing it overall. I think the Democrats. If you guys enjoyed the video, please say so down below. Feedback on this channel is very important. If you like the video, leave a like, subscribe, share with your friends. It's the only way for small channels like mine to continue to grow. If you guys would like to see more videos like this, just let me know, and I hope you guys have a good day. See ya.